It started with a noise that felt like the earth was shaking. The loud rumble of tank engines all together created a metal wall moving across fields and roads that had been battle zones for months. On that day, when General George S. Patton let loose his tanks, the German lines that seemed strong suddenly broke like glass. Allied soldiers who had been stuck in slow fighting the week before were shocked as the Third Army pushed forward, leaving behind smoke and chaos. For the first time in weeks, the battlefield felt alive, moving, and unstoppable. The sudden burst of speed was so complete and powerful that even experienced leaders would later struggle to explain how 60 men disappeared in just 24 hours. Patton had always been known as someone who took risks, a man who loved speed, daring, and surprise. His critics thought he was careless, obsessed with showiness and personal fame. His soldiers saw him as full of energy, asking them to do the impossible and somehow getting it done. This day would show both sides of his story, the quick urgency of his orders and the amazing results of his boldness. The German army, already weakened by losses and lack of supplies, could not handle such a hit. What happened was more like a flood than a battle, a tank surge that moved faster than maps could show and faster than headquarters could understand. The breakthrough was not expected. For weeks, Allied planners had argued about the best way to use openings after the German defenses in Normandy fell apart. Some worried that supply lines could not keep up with a deep push, and they suggested being careful and only moving as far as supplies allowed. But Patton had no patience for doing things halfway. He had studied history, especially the campaigns of Napoleon and the fast-moving tactics of the Germans themselves. He believed speed was the key, that if his tanks could push far and fast enough, the enemy's mind would break before his body did. And on that day in August, he would prove it was true. The German soldiers facing the attack had little warning. They were used to slow fighting, fixed lines, and predictable artillery fire. But now they were suddenly attacked by tank columns that seemed to come from nowhere, smashing through villages before defenses could be set up. Roadblocks were crushed, machine gun nests were avoided, and headquarters were taken over before messengers could even deliver orders. Survivors later remembered feeling like they were being chased not just by men, but by time itself, as if the American advance was moving faster than thought. For the men inside the tanks, it was both exciting and scary. Crews sat in tight metal boxes, deafened by engines and the clanging of tracks, their bodies shaken by the rough ground. Dust filled their lungs and the heat was unbearable, but adrenaline kept them going. Every hour new towns were left behind. The commanders barely slept, going on instinct. Maps were covered in grease, and Patton kept pushing them to keep moving. To stop was to lose speed. And for Patton, speed was everything. By the end of that 24-hour period, the Third Army had done what many thought was impossible: a tank push of 60 miles, cutting deep into enemy territory. The achievement was not just a win on the battlefield, but a shock to the enemy's confidence. The Germans had been embarrassed, their lines broken. The Allies had shown that their tanks could not only match, but beat the speed that the German army was known for. And Patton himself had become known as the master of fast war, a commander who could control time and distance to his advantage. It was truly a day that changed the course of the war. The soldiers who lived through it never forgot it. The roar of tanks, the blur of the countryside, the strange feeling that what seemed impossible in the morning had become real by nightfall. History would remember it as a single powerful day, when metal and willpower joined to tear open the battlefield and prove again that in modern war, speed was the most powerful weapon. In the weeks before the breakthrough, the Western Front had been tense, tired, and almost still. After the initial success of the Normandy landings, Allied armies struggled to keep moving forward. Roads were blocked with wreckage, bridges were destroyed, and supply trucks were slowed by bad roads and the huge need for fuel, ammunition, and food. Every step forward seemed to require a lot of planning. For Patton, who believed that hesitation was the biggest enemy, this feeling of delay was unbearable. He walked around his command posts impatiently, pushing staff officers to find ways around problems, pressuring supply officers for more fuel, and asking his subordinates for a speed they could hardly imagine. The Germans, for their part, were not doing nothing. Field Marshal von Luga and later his replacement von Zangen tried to put broken units back together into defensive lines across France. Tank divisions were moved like pieces on a chessboard to try to slow down the Allied advance. The Waffen-SS still had experienced units capable of strong counterattacks, and infantry groups dug into hedges and villages with determination. Although weakened, the German army still knew how to defend, and Allied commanders knew that a poorly planned attack could end in disaster. That was why many officers hesitated to risk fast advances that went beyond their supply lines. Patton saw the same dangers, but he chose to see them differently. He knew fuel was short. By late summer, the Third Army was using over 500,000 gallons of gasoline each day. But he believed that the very act of moving forward would force supply lines to adapt. He argued that stopping would give the Germans time to recover. He had studied their methods, their use of reserves, their reliance on rail transport. He understood that the key was to stop them from regrouping. In one staff meeting, he famously said, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." He was completely sure. Speed was not just an option. It was survival. This building tension was not just about supplies, but also about how people felt. Soldiers in the ranks felt it too. Infantrymen walked through French villages still damaged from months of being occupied, while tank crews worked on their Shermans and half-tracks with nervous energy. Rumors spread through the camps. Stories of German tanks regrouping and desperate counterattacks planned by Hitler himself. Each day of delay felt heavier. Patton's men began to think that only by moving could they escape this suffocating standstill. Meanwhile, Allied High Command discussed strategy. General Omar Bradley, who oversaw the 12th Army Group, weighed careful steps against bold attacks. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, worried about stretching too far and leaving flanks open. Montgomery in the north pushed his own plans, arguing for focused attacks in Belgium and Holland. Patton, never afraid to speak his mind, constantly argued that boldness would win the war faster than caution. This difference in opinions caused friction, but also showed how unique Patton was. Where others saw problems, he saw opportunities. The conditions on the ground made this tension worse. Bridges across rivers like the Lire and the Seine became bottlenecks. Engineers worked day and night to keep vehicles moving. Dusty summer heat covered uniforms and clogged engines, while airfields filled with C-47 transport planes struggling to deliver supplies closer to the front. German aircraft, though weakened, still launched occasional raids on convoys, and snipers bothered rear units. Every mile gained cost resources that were dangerously low. But in Patton's mind, this pressure only made it more important to attack. Before German commanders could strengthen their broken defenses, when the day of the breakthrough finally came, it was not by chance, but from this mix of preparation, tension, and urgency. The stress of waiting, the endless arguments at headquarters, and the desperate juggling of supplies created an atmosphere where the sudden burst of movement felt inevitable. To Patton, the weeks of pressure were like winding a spring as tight as possible. When he finally released his tanks, the energy of that built-up tension exploded across the French countryside, sweeping aside everything in its path. At the heart of the coming storm was the complex network of orders, discussions, and clashing egos that shaped Allied strategy. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had the job of coordinating armies from different countries, each led by strong-willed generals with different ideas about how to defeat Germany. Omar Bradley, careful and thoughtful, preferred slow advances, making sure that supply lines were secure and that flanks were protected. Across the Channel, Bernard Montgomery pushed for his big plan to drive into the Low Countries, a plan that needed a lot of resources and attention. Against this background, George S. Patton pushed his own vision, an attack so fast and powerful that the enemy would never recover. The arguments were not just theoretical. Every decision involved thousands of lives, huge amounts of fuel, and the speed of the liberation of Europe itself. Eisenhower knew the risks of moving too fast. Allied armies were already using huge amounts of supplies, and the ports of northern France were still blocked with wreckage from previous battles. Cherbourg had been captured, but its facilities were limited. Antwerp, with its large docks, was still out of reach. Patton's request for priority fuel meant taking resources from other commanders, and tempers flared in meetings where gallons of gasoline were discussed like gold. Patton was very persuasive. He had already shown his ability to shock the enemy with fast movements, especially in the sudden turn of the Third Army during the relief of Bastonia later in the war. In the summer of 1944, he argued with his usual passion. He reminded Eisenhower and Bradley that German morale was weak, that Hitler's orders often prevented flexible retreats, and that speed would take advantage of the chaos. Bradley, though often annoyed by Patton's showmanship, could not ignore the results his subordinate achieved. Eisenhower, balancing caution with opportunity, gradually agreed to give Patton more freedom, but always keeping an eye on the supply situation. Inside Patton's own headquarters, the atmosphere was exciting. His staff officers worked hard to improve routes, allocate convoys, and scout bridges strong enough to hold heavy tanks. Radio operators kept in constant contact with forward units, while intelligence officers studied intercepted messages to guess where German reserves might appear. Patton pushed his subordinates hard, demanding precise plans, but also expecting them to adapt when conditions changed. He famously told them that in battle a good plan executed quickly was better than a perfect plan executed too late. German high command, meanwhile, was giving its own conflicting orders. Hitler refused to allow flexible withdrawals, insisting on holding ground at all costs. Commanders in the field, caught between impossible orders and failing defenses, tried to slow the Allies with roadblocks, demolitions, and rearguard actions. But with their communications disrupted by Allied air power, coordination was failing. Patton sensed this weakness. He felt that if he hit hard enough, the Germans would collapse, not because they lacked courage, but because their command system was already falling apart. In the middle of these debates, Patton's own personality stood out. He was showy, direct, and often used bad language, wearing polished helmets and ivory-handled pistols like a cartoon of a warrior. His men both feared and admired him, knowing that he could get angry, but also that his relentless drive pushed them to achieve the impossible. When orders came down, giving the Third Army the fuel and permission it needed, Patton wasted no time. Where others might have hesitated, he seized the opportunity with great speed. The stage was set not by chance, but by a clash of ideas, caution against boldness, calculation against instinct. The breakthrough that would follow was not just a triumph of steel and gasoline, but also of one man's determination to shape strategy to his will. It was Patton's ability to push through hesitation, both his enemies and his allies, that opened the door to the tank charge of 60 mortars in a single day. When the first engine started, the French countryside shook under the weight of metal. Lines of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and armored cars stretched as far as the eye could see, their shapes blurred by clouds of dust, kicked up from the dry summer roads. Mechanics had worked through the night, checking treads, refueling, and patching bullet holes with whatever scrap metal they could find. Now, as dawn broke, the men climbed into their machines, each crew knowing that they were about to be part of a push that would test the limits of both man and machine. The roar of tanks was unlike anything people in occupied towns had ever heard. Farmers stopped working, staring in shock as dozens of tanks rattled past their fields, the air shaking with the loud rhythm of engines. Children ran to the roadside, waving shyly, unsure if this sudden burst of American power was real or a dream. For the soldiers, though, there was no romance. The inside of a tank was a world of deafening noise, stifling heat, and the constant smell of fuel, oil, and gunpowder. Conversations had to be shouted, and most orders were given by hand signals or quick gestures. The armored spearhead moved in tight formations, each vehicle relying on the one ahead to keep pace and direction. Reconnaissance jeeps darted ahead, scouting for ambushes, mines, or blown bridges. Engineers followed closely, ready to clear obstacles or make quick repairs under fire. Above, fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force patrolled the skies, strafing German convoys and marking targets with smoke rockets. The teamwork between ground and air forces gave the Third Army an advantage the German army could no longer match. Every few miles, bursts of combat broke out. German machine gun nests hidden in barns or church towers fired at the advancing columns. But instead of stopping, Patton's units responded with overwhelming speed. Tanks turned their turrets, firing high-explosive shells that reduced strong points to rubble in minutes. Anti-tank guns, hastily wheeled into position by retreating enemy troops, were often silenced before they could fire more than a few rounds. Resistance that might have slowed a careful advance was simply pushed aside by momentum. The fast pace itself became a weapon for the tank crews. Every hour felt like a test of endurance. Gunners strained their eyes through periscopes, constantly scanning hedges for movement. Drivers gripped levers with blistered hands, guiding heavy tanks over rough roads. Commanders stood half-exposed in their hatches, wind whipping their faces as they shouted into radios. The rhythm of advance was hard. Fight, move, refuel, and fight again. Yet adrenaline and Patton's reputation drove them forward. Soldiers believed their commander would not accept any hesitation, that if they slowed down, he would be there personally, cursing them into motion. The effect on morale was strong. Infantry riding on the backs of tanks felt invincible as the armored vehicles moved forward, crushing obstacles under their tracks. Artillery batteries struggled to keep up, firing quickly from roadside fields before quickly moving their guns and racing after the columns. Supply trucks, often forgotten in stories of glory, became lifelines, weaving through narrow lanes loaded with gasoline cans and crates of rations. Without them, the steel tide would stop. With them, the advance seemed endless. German observers who saw the spectacle were stunned. Reports from German officers spoke of endless lines of American tanks advancing with a confidence that suggested they had unlimited reserves. The sheer noise of it, the grinding of gears, the clatter of tracks, the drone of aircraft created the impression of an unstoppable machine. For German soldiers who had once been masters of fast war, it was a bitter reversal. Now they were the ones being overrun by speed and surprise. As the day went on, the countryside itself showed signs of the powerful passage. Roads cracked under the weight of hundreds of vehicles. Fields were turned into mud, and villages echoed with the metallic roar of engines. Yet for Patton, this was exactly the vision he had long imagined. War as movement, war as momentum, war as a storm of iron moving forward faster than the enemy could understand. By the evening of that important day, maps could hardly keep up with reality. What had started as a focused push had turned into one of the most amazing advances of the war. Almost 60 uncovered in a single 24-hour period. The numbers alone were incredible. Tank columns had crossed more ground in one day than many infantry divisions covered in a week. Fuel convoys struggled to keep up, rushing forward at dangerous speeds just to keep Patton's Shermans and half-tracks moving. Staff officers wrote furiously, trying to record the rapid series of towns freed, bridges crossed, and crossroads secured. But their charts were out of date almost as soon as they were drawn. The sheer size of the advance added to its drama. French villages that had suffered years of occupation suddenly found themselves passed in minutes by roaring columns of American armor. Roads that had once seemed endless under German control were swallowed before locals even realized the front had moved. In one town, a church bell was rung not for Sunday Mass, but to warn residents that tanks were coming. By the time the bell had stopped, the Americans were already out the other side. For regular people who had gotten used to living under enemy control for a while, the fast freedom felt hard to believe. From a planning perspective, the 60-mile push was more than just a symbolic achievement. It ruined what the German army thought about how fast the Allied forces could move. The German army's plan always counted on the idea that not having enough supplies would hold the Allies back. But Patton's choice to keep pushing without stopping and trust that supplies would catch up changed that idea. German soldiers told to set up roadblocks found they were passed before they could even dig in. Commanders trying to create new defensive lines realized that their planned spots were already behind enemy tanks. Even the Allies were shocked. Other leaders, naturally careful, had doubted that going such long distances was possible without falling apart under their own weight. But as reports came into headquarters, it became clear that Patton's idea of keeping the momentum going was working in a big way. British officers used to Montgomery's slow pace were amazed by how bold their American partner was. Eisenhower himself, while worried about pushing too far, couldn't deny how well it was working. But for the soldiers inside the tanks, The day was a constant blur of motion. Some crews claimed they had driven through half of France without really stopping. Fuel stops were quick and crazy. Drivers jumped out with gas cans while the engines were still running. Loaders grabbed a few bites of food while mechanics tightened screws and checked for damage. Rest was almost impossible. One gunner later remembered that he didn't remember the towns they passed through. Just the feeling of constant shaking and the sound of orders shouted through the radio. The Germans were not ready for such constant chasing. Retreating groups were caught on small roads bombed by fighter planes and shot at by approaching tanks before they could get away. Bridges they had planned to blow up were captured unharmed, sometimes just minutes before the bombs could be set off. Field reports talked about units falling apart in panic, leaving equipment behind, and running into the woods. The German army's famous discipline was breaking under the same pressure it had once put on others. The meaning of 60 million 24 hours went beyond just the military. Allied newspapers back home grabbed onto the number, using it as proof that the war in Europe was ending. Headlines said Patton's tanks were unstoppable, and soldiers' families at home read proudly about the sudden lightning strike sweeping across France. Whether it was propaganda or not, the image of speed became as important as the reality. It reassured people tired of years of war that winning was not just possible, but coming soon. By nightfall, Patton's headquarters was buzzing with messages that confirmed what even the boldest guesses hadn't dared to expect. The Third Army had not just moved forward, it had changed what was thought possible in tank warfare. In just 24 hours, 60 miles of enemy land had been wiped off the German map, and the momentum now seemed impossible to stop. For the German army, the shock of Patton's tank attack was crushing. At first, frontline units tried to use the same tactics they had used earlier in the war, setting up rear guards, trapping attackers in ambushes, and using anti-tank guns to slow down tank advances. But the speed of the American advance made those methods useless. Command posts often found that the land they planned to defend was already controlled by the enemy. Radio operators reported confusing messages, officers shouting for help, only to find out that their backup groups had been cut off or destroyed before arriving. German morale, already weak after months of losses in Normandy, started to break under the pressure. Panzer divisions, once symbols of German strength, found themselves stuck due to lack of fuel and constant attacks from Allied airplanes. Columns of trucks were destroyed on highways, their wreckage blocking escape routes. One captured officer sadly admitted that it felt like the Americans had mastered our own weapon, Blitzkrieg, and were now using it even better. Soldiers used to being the hunters were suddenly the hunted, running through hedgerows as tank shells exploded around them. The failure of communication systems made the chaos worse. Allied bombing raids had already destroyed important railway hubs, forcing the Germans to rely on road transport. Telephone lines were cut, and messengers on motorcycles were often caught or killed by advancing American patrols. Entire regiments operated blindly, unaware of where their allies or the enemy were. In such confusion, rumors spread quickly. Some units believed Patton had twice as many tanks as he really did. Others thought airborne landings had happened behind their lines. Fear made things seem worse, causing paralysis in the ranks. Civilian stories showed the confusion clearly. In town after town, German troops left their posts in a hurry, sometimes leaving half-eaten meals on tables or equipment scattered in barns. Villagers described soldiers marching one way in the morning and retreating the other way by nightfall. The power that the occupiers had enforced for years crumbled overnight, replaced by scenes of desperation. Wagons overloaded with supplies, horses pulling artillery pieces down rutted lanes, officers shouting uselessly at men who no longer wanted to fight. Strategically, the breakthrough created huge gaps in the German defense network. Divisions that had been carefully placed to form a solid line were cut apart into isolated pieces. Attempts to regroup often ended in being surrounded. Patton's tanks took advantage of every weakness, bypassing strong points to attack rear areas, cutting supply lines, and forcing the enemy to abandon positions without a fight. This domino effect, one unit breaking then another, was like a dam breaking under pressure with each crack widening into full collapse. The mental impact was perhaps even greater than the physical losses. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed the German army as unbeatable, able to stop any attack. Now soldiers watched their defenses fall apart in hours. Letters intercepted from the front showed despair. One infantryman told his family that we marched without knowing where, chased like animals. The idea of German control in France disappeared, replaced by the harsh reality that their army was being pushed eastward with no chance to recover. Even the German high command couldn't hide the panic. Reports sent to Hitler's headquarters were contradictory, full of exaggerations and desperate pleas. Some officers downplayed the disaster to avoid his anger, while others exaggerated it to demand reinforcements that would never come. Hitler's refusal to allow strategic withdrawals only made the situation worse, as units ordered to stand and fight were destroyed before they could even set up positions. The paralysis at the top spread downward, leaving entire corps without direction. By the end of the advance, German forces in the area had not simply been pushed back. They had been disoriented, broken up, and stripped of their sense of control. Patton's attack had exposed the German army's biggest weakness, its reliance on centralized command, and its inability to adapt to an enemy moving faster than its orders could travel. In just one day, the German army learned that the Allies had taken control for good. Behind the success of the tank advance was a quieter but equally important reality: the huge strain put on both the soldiers and the machines. Tanks were made for battle, not for constant travel across many miles in a single day. The Sherman, the main tank of Patton's Third Army, was strong and reliable compared to its German counterparts. But even it could break down when pushed to the limit. Tracks wore thin, engines overheated, and transmissions failed under the constant stress of high-speed movement across rough country roads. Maintenance crews worked non-stop, crawling under hot hulls, replacing wheels, tightening screws, and draining overheated radiators while the columns kept moving forward without stopping. The human cost was just as high. Tank crews lived in conditions that were almost unbearable. Inside the armored hulls, temperatures rose well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat-soaked uniforms, goggles fogged up, and lungs filled with exhaust fumes and dust from the countryside. Gunners strained their eyes through scopes for hours without rest, while drivers gripped levers until their hands blistered. Officers shouted orders through crackling radios, often repeating themselves because the roar of the engines drowned out speech. The advance allowed no time for rest. Men grabbed moments of sleep, leaning against gun parts or slumped over turret rims, only to be jolted awake as the tank lurched forward again. Infantry soldiers assigned to support the tank units suffered their own hardship. Many were ordered to ride on top of tanks, holding on to steel handholds as the columns rumbled across uneven ground. The bumpy ride bruised and battered them, but it was faster than walking. Others walked behind, lungs aching from the dust clouds raised by hundreds of vehicles. Artillerymen sprinted to keep up, limbering guns, firing quick missions, then racing ahead again. Even supply drivers faced constant pressure. Convoys of fuel and ammunition were pushed as hard as the tanks themselves, often moving with headlights off to avoid being seen. Exhaustion became a constant problem. Medics reported growing numbers of cases of heat exhaustion, dehydration, and combat fatigue. Soldiers chewed on dry rations, too rushed to boil coffee or heat meals. Many ran out of cigarettes, a thing as valuable as ammunition in keeping morale up. Letters written in stolen minutes talked about tiredness close to collapse, but also about pride. The men knew they were part of something special, a feat that future generations would remember. The quick fixes needed due to the constant advance showed how flexible Patton's command was. When tanks broke down, they were taken apart for parts instead of being towed to the rear. Mechanics did amazing things with limited tools, welding torn armor plates with field kits or patching fuel lines with strips of rubber. Soldiers joked grimly that their machines were held together with sweat and curses. But somehow the columns kept rolling, a testament to the strength of both the machines and the men who operated them. Still, the physical cost was clear. Soldiers later remembered seeing things that weren't there from lack of sleep, mistaking hedges for enemy ambushes or hearing voices in the drone of engines. Officers worried that if the pace didn't slow down, men would collapse before the enemy could even fight back. But Patton's way of thinking was unyielding. Momentum had to be maintained at all costs. He believed that fatigue could be endured, that discipline would carry soldiers beyond their breaking point. His constant drive inspired admiration, but also resentment. To some, it seemed he cared more for speed than for the bodies left behind. And yet, in hindsight, it was exactly this willingness to demand the impossible that made the feat of 60 mi in one day possible. The strain on men and machines was huge, but the result proved that even the toughest limits could be pushed back when speed itself became a weapon. In war, Patton showed exhaustion was not a problem but a cost, and victory, however brief, was worth paying that price. As the tank columns pushed deeper into France, their arrival changed the lives of civilians who had suffered years of enemy control. In town after town, the sound of approaching tanks was met first with fear, then with disbelief, and finally with bursts of joy. People emerged cautiously from cellars where they had hidden during the shelling, waving color flags that had been secretly kept since 1940. Church bells silenced under German rule rang loudly as Patton's men rumbled through cobblestone squares. For many, the sight of American soldiers perched on tanks was the unmistakable sign that freedom had truly arrived. The encounters were often chaotic. Crowds surged around vehicles, pressing gifts of bread, wine, and fruit into the hands of surprised soldiers. Young women kissed dust-covered GIs, while elderly men shook their hands with tears streaming down their faces. Some villagers brought out hastily painted signs that read, "Vive Lim," while others shouted warnings about German troops retreating nearby. In some places, the welcome was almost overwhelming. Tank crews had to push through dense gatherings just to maintain their advance. For men who had spent weeks inside stifling steel hulls, the sudden warmth of freed civilians was both thrilling and confusing. But freedom also had a darker side. Skirmishes broke out in the very towns being freed, as isolated pockets of German troops resisted to the last. Civilians caught in the crossfire sometimes suffered alongside their liberators. Walls crumbled from tank shells. Barns caught fire from tracer fire, and terrified families huddled in cellars until the battle passed. In the aftermath, villagers sometimes discovered their homes reduced to rubble, even as they celebrated the end of enemy control. War's brutality did not spare those who had waited longest for freedom. The liberation also exposed years of built-up anger. In many towns, collaborators who had helped the German occupiers were dragged into the streets by their neighbors. Women accused of being with enemy soldiers were humiliated, their heads shaved in public squares. Local resistance fighters who had operated secretly for so long emerged openly to assist the Americans, pointing out hidden snipers or guiding tanks around mined roads. For Patton soldiers, the scenes were a reminder that the war was not only fought on battlefields, but also in the lives of ordinary people who had borne its weight in silence. The logistical challenge of passing through freed areas added another layer of complexity. Villages became choked with humanity as civilians offered directions, warnings, and sometimes misinformation. Children darted dangerously close to convoys, eager to grab candy or chocolate tossed from passing trucks. Military police worked non-stop to keep roadways clear, aware that any delay risked slowing the momentum of the advance. Despite the confusion, the enthusiasm of civilians provided a mental boost to men running on fumes. Letters home talked about kisses, flowers, and celebrations, small pieces of humanity amid the grind of war. The strategic value of liberation was clear. Every town seized from German control meant fewer supply lines for the enemy, fewer hiding places for their rear units, and more intelligence for the Allies. Local guides revealed back roads unknown to maps, while members of the French resistance provided details about German positions. In some cases, partisans even joined the column, riding on jeeps with armbands, declaring their loyalty to Free France. Their knowledge of the terrain often saved hours, allowing Patton's advance to maintain its astonishing pace. The memory of that day lingered long after the tanks had passed. For civilians, it was the moment when the gray shadow of enemy control was lifted by the sudden rush of olive drab and white stars. For the Americans, it was proof that their sacrifice had real meaning. They were not just seizing land but restoring freedom. Each freed village became a living symbol of why they pushed themselves past exhaustion, why engines were kept running despite breakdowns, and why momentum mattered more than rest. In the eyes of cheering civilians, they found justification for Patton's constant demand to keep moving. The immediate benefits of Patton's lightning strike were visible on the map, but the deeper results unfolded in the weeks that followed. By smashing through 60 mi of German-held land in a single day, the Third Army broke the fragile balance of the Western Front. The German army, already weakened by the costly battles in Normandy, suddenly found itself struggling, its divisions scattered, and its supply lines cut. Entire corps were forced to retreat without order, leaving equipment behind to avoid being surrounded. Patton's move not only freed land, but also tore apart the organizational structure of enemy defenses. One of the most important results was the collapse of German supply centers. Rail hubs essential for moving men and supplies were captured or destroyed before they could be evacuated. Supply depots filled with ammunition, fuel, and rations fell into Allied hands, further starving German units of the resources they needed to fight. Truck convoys, once lifelines for withdrawing formations, were destroyed on clogged highways by Allied air attacks coordinated with Patton's forward observers. The German army's ability to launch any organized counterattack disappeared under the combined pressure of air power and tank pursuit. Strategically, this big move made it possible to free central and eastern France. With the German army falling apart east of the Seine, the Allies were able to move toward Belgium and Luxembourg much faster than they thought they could. Towns like Reims, Nancy, and Metz, which used to seem like big challenges, were now within easy reach. The speed of things made German leaders have to come up with quick plans, putting together random groups of soldiers from destroyed units. These quickly made defenses couldn't stop the constant push from the Allies. This move also had important effects on politics. The French government, led by Charles de Gaulle, got stronger, as freed cities welcomed both Allied soldiers and French units. Every mile Patton moved forward made the new French government seem more real, weakening those loyal to Vichy, and showing the world that France was getting its power back. For Eisenhower, the fast move forward showed how important it was to match political goals with army actions, making sure that freed areas were quickly made stable to stop problems among the Allies. Patton's success changed bigger military discussions. People who didn't think fast tank attacks were possible had to think again. Bradley and Eisenhower, while still worried about having enough supplies, realized that being brave could lead to big wins. Even Montgomery, known for being careful, admitted that Patton's risky move had done something amazing. The success let Eisenhower push harder across the whole battle line, making sure the Germans couldn't regroup anywhere without facing huge pressure. For the Germans, the results were terrible beyond just losing right away. Hitler's insistence on strong defense, along with his refusal to allow flexible retreats, made the situation much worse. Units that could have retreated safely were slowly destroyed. Commanders complained that they were being told to defend lines that weren't even there anymore. The idea that Germany couldn't be beaten, which was already damaged after Normandy, was completely destroyed. Soldiers who used to march confidently now retreated in a mess, many surrendering without even shooting. This caused problems all the way to the Eastern Front. As the German High Command struggled to fix holes in the West, fewer soldiers could be sent to fight the Soviet armies moving forward. Resources that could have slowed down the Red Army were used up trying to stop Patton's powerful advance. In this way, the 60-mile advance had effects around the world. It sped up the fall of Germany's ability to fight a war on two fronts. In the end, the important results of that day weren't just about distance, but about speed. Armies that move fast take not only land, but also control, forcing their enemies to always react and retreat. Patton's push showed this idea perfectly. The German command no longer decided how the war went. The Allies did. That change in speed was more valuable than any single town or bridge, because it made sure the war in the West would never slow down to the difficult standstill the Germans really wanted. When historians later thought about that single day of fast advance, they saw it as more than just a success on the battlefield. It was a perfect example of George S. Patton's whole way of thinking about war. For Patton, war was about speed and determination. He thought armies won not just by having more soldiers or better weapons, but by taking control mentally, overwhelming the enemy before they could react. The 60-mile push in 24 hours showed this belief, proving that surprise and speed could achieve what careful planning alone never could. The importance of that day became closely tied to Patton's personal story. Supporters pointed to it as proof of his skill, the reason he deserved to be remembered alongside the great leaders of history. They compared his tank rush to the horse charges of Alexander, Caesar, or Napoleon, but with steel and gasoline. Critics, however, argued that he had risked going too far, that if German counterattacks had been stronger, the advance might have failed completely. Yet even those who criticized him admitted that the boldness of the move was a blow that the enemy never recovered from. For the soldiers who were there, the memory stayed strong. Tank crews remembered the loud engines that seemed to never stop, the blurry countryside rushing past, and the disbelief that such distances could be covered in so little time. Infantrymen remembered the tiredness, the dust, and the quick glimpses of cheering people. Supply drivers, often forgotten in stories of success, felt proud of keeping the war machine going with fuel and ammunition at an impossible speed. Each group knew they had been part of something that went beyond the usual fighting at the front. In the bigger picture of the war, the advance was a turning point in the fight for Western Europe. It showed that Allied forces could not only match, but beat the speed that the German blitzkrieg used to have. It reassured tired people that being freed was not just a dream, but a reality that was happening fast. It gave confidence to Allied leaders who were eager for good news and saw the story as proof that victory was coming faster. In newspapers across America and Britain, headlines shouted numbers of miles and hours, simplifying the complicated war into a symbol of unstoppable speed. The story also taught lessons for future soldiers and military thinkers. Military schools studied the operation as an example of using movement, combined forces, and strong leadership. They noted how important supplies were, the need for air and ground forces to work together, and the value of taking advantage of the enemy's confusion. Yet, they also recognized the personal aspect, the energy that Patton's strong will brought to the advance that no manual could teach. Without his insistence and his refusal to slow down, the achievement might never have happened. In the end, the day became part of Patton's lasting story, one of those moments where history becomes legend. The 60-mile drive in 24 hours was not just a success in battle, but a symbol of how daring can change the course of a war. It was a reminder that wars are won not only by planning and weapons, but by being willing to demand more than seems possible, and to act so fast that the enemy's will breaks before their defenses do. For those who study the Second World War, it remains a high point of tank warfare, a story of strength and determination. And for the men who rode in those tanks, who sweated in their steel boxes, or who marched behind the tanks, it was a day when tiredness and fear were overshadowed by history happening. A day when George S. Patton proved that speed itself could be a weapon as powerful as any gun or bomb.